Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This morning we'll have another sutta study, looking at a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 4, sutta number 10, called the Yoga Sutta. We'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll go through the discourse and give some translation and explanation as we go along. So, beginning with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So as mentioned, we'll be looking at the Yoga Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya 4.10, so chapter 4, Sutta number 10. So this is a relatively short discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, and it begins with the Buddha saying, Chattaro me bhikkhave yoga. So the Buddha says, monks, there are these 4 kinds of yoga. And at this point, you might be thinking, wait, what are we talking about here? I thought yoga was a Hindu thing. What does that have to do with Buddhism? Of course, the Buddha used the existing language of the time and also the existing terminology of the time and turned it towards his own purposes, his own teachings. In the suttas, the word yoga has 2 main meanings. One of them, actually the most common usage of the word yoga, is in the sense of attachment. This is not in a positive sense, but rather in the sense of being bound to something. Being stuck on something. Attachment in a negative sense, in the sense of something that we can't let go of. And in a few places, it's also used in a sense of meaning commitment. So what one is really committed to. For example, bhavananu yoga. So this is the yoga, the commitment to practicing bhavana, to practicing the development of the mind. So bhavananu yoga would be the commitment to developing the mind. So it's sometimes used in that way of meaning a commitment or a dedication. But most commonly, we see the word yoga used in the sense of attachment, something that we can't let go of. And the word yoga, it actually comes from the word yuga, which means a pair. It also has the sense of the what you would use to attach a work animal to a cart or a plow. So, for example, you have a horse or an ox or something which is pulling a cart or pulling a plow or doing some kind of work, and you need it to be restrained and controlled. So this is what would basically trap the service animal into its role. So this also is pointing to yoga then as meaning that which traps us and restricts us, that which forces us into a specific role, a burdensome task of some sort. So putting all this together, we can see that in the Buddhist text, the word yoga normally has a very negative meaning, very negative connotation. So again, these days you say the word yoga and people think of like people in tight clothing doing fancy stretching exercises. But if you see the word yoga in the early Buddhist texts, it normally means this sense of painful, burdensome restriction generated by our own attachments and our own reluctance to let go. So again, etymologically, the words are the same, but the usage is quite different. So the sutta begins, Chataro me yoga. There are these 4 kinds of yoga. And as we go through the text, we'll see which meaning the Buddha is using for the word yoga here. It says, Katame Chataro, what for? Kama yogo, bhava yogo, ditti yogo, avijja yogo. So kama yogo means the attachment or dedication to sensuality. So kama meaning any kind of sensory experience. And particularly it tends to have this meaning of the pursuit of pleasant or enjoyable sensory experiences. The next one, bhava yogo. So bhava, this is a word which gets translated as being or becoming or state of existence, or sometimes more generally as ego, self-being. Again, kama yoga, it's quite simple and straightforward. It's the devotion or attachment to pursuing sensual gratification, sensory stimulation, pleasant sensory experiences. Bhava yoga it's a bit more subtle. So this is pursuing particular states of being. So it's not necessarily trying to find good food and good entertainment and so on, as with kama yoga. But bhava yoga can be like, well, I want to be a teacher, or I want to be respected, or I want to live in that particular country or that particular place, or I want to have a particular kind of self-identity. These are all examples of bhava yoga. So attachment to a particular kind of being, a particular state of existence, a particular kind of self-identity. So wanting to acquire a state of being or a self-identity or experience that we don't have would be actually bhava tanha. And attachment to what we already have would be bhava yoga. So whatever state of being we're currently in, we get stuck on it and we don't want to let go of it. We're not willing to allow things to change. We're not open to the possibility of things being okay in a different way. So this is bhava yoga, this attachment to a state of being, attachment to a particular experience or self-identity. And bhava also can have a very broad sense of just meaning any kind of being or state of existence whatsoever. So bhava yoga then can also, in its broadest sense, just be attachment to the experience of being an individual, the experience of individual existence, which actually is connected to one of the root problems in the mind, one of the basic core defilements of mind that obstructs us from awakening, which is the obstruction that we call asmimana. Asmimana means the concept of self-existence, the concept I am, I exist, I am an individual. So again, bhava yoga is this attachment to me, this attachment to individual existence. And then the third one, ditti yoga. So the word ditti literally means view or perspective. Our viewpoint, our opinions, our beliefs, our ways of looking at the world, which again is a major place of attachment. So we have, well, my opinion is such and such. I see the world in this way. And we tend to get very attached to our viewpoints, our opinions. And actually, often we don't even recognize that they're just viewpoints and opinions. We think like, no, this is the way things are. It's not just my opinion, it's the truth. It's the way things really are. But somehow there's other people who also see things the way they really are, and yet somehow they see it differently than we do. So it's always important to really closely look, like, am I actually seeing things objectively and clearly, or is it just that I have a different perspective than somebody else? Is it just that my underlying beliefs and opinions are different from theirs, and therefore I'm having a different experience. So one of the common similes that we come up that we use in from the suttas is the simile of the blind people touching an elephant. So one blind person touches the trunk and says, "Oh, an elephant, it's kind of like a snake. It's long, it's round, it's kind of like a snake." Another person touches its ear and is like, an elephant. It's thin and papery, kind of like a fan. And somebody else, they touch the elephant's tail and they're like, the elephant, it's soft. It feels a bit like a broom. And somebody else touches the leg and they're like, it's kind of like a tree trunk. And somebody else touches its side and they're like, it's kind of like a wall. And so each one of them is actually true from their own perspective. Each one is right from their own perspective. But then the story goes on that then they all start arguing with each other about, like, the one who touches the leg is like, this is definitely nothing like a fan. So the one who touched the tail, the one who thinks it's a fan, is clearly totally wrong. And then the one who touched the trunk is like, it's definitely like a snake. I don't know what these other lunatics are talking about. Clearly they don't know what they're talking about. So then they all start arguing about, like, only I am right, everybody else is wrong. But they're not recognizing that it's just because they have their own limited perspective, their own limited view. So often this is what comes up with when we're interacting with others, is that we're attached to our own particular view, our own ideas and opinions. And so then naturally we just assume that everybody else must be wrong. They must be, since they're having a different experience, it must just be that they're wrong, that they're perceiving things incorrectly. So, and sometimes it's just really simple things, like we're like, well, I believe taxes should be lower, and someone else is like, well, I believe taxes should be higher, and I'm like, and I believe I have no idea how taxation works, so I'm ineligible to have an opinion on the matter. And it's like, well, ultimately, what does it matter? So we all have different opinions about it, but who cares? Like, what's the big deal? Where it actually does become relevant is when it comes into the Dhamma. So when it comes to the Dhamma, we're actually trying to put down our opinions and instead to see what the Dhamma is on its own terms. But in terms of worldly things, it's like, of course, we all have different opinions. It's important then not to get fixated on our opinions, but rather to recognize that that's all they are. And also that our particular viewpoints and opinions are primarily the result of external conditions. It's the result of our upbringing. It's the result of what we learned from our family. It's a result of what we learned in school. It's a result of what we learned from mass media. It's a result of what we learned from the country that we live in, what we learned from the experiences that we have throughout our life. So we think these are my opinions, but actually they're not personal. They're predominantly the result of external conditions. So we can't even really say they're my opinions or my views, but rather we can say these are the products of external conditioning. So for example, if something is scheduled for 8 o'clock, then it's my view that we should all definitely be there well before 8 o'clock and ready to go. But then somebody who has a different upbringing, a different culture, a different viewpoint, they might wander in the room at 8:30 and think that's totally acceptable, and actually wonder why these neurotic Americans are so concerned about somebody showing up at 8:30. It's like, you said it was 8 o'clock and I showed up at 8:30. What's the problem? And then those of us who are here at 7:55 are like, how can you possibly think this isn't a problem? So it's a matter of, again, this difference in ditti, this difference in view. And each person is from their own perspective correct. But none of it is personal. It's just the product of external conditioning. And then the fourth one is avijja yoga. So avijja means ignorance, a lack of true understanding. So this term vidya, again, it's we translate the word avijja as ignorance commonly. It's a bit of an insufficient translation because the word vidya means a true knowledge, a true understanding. So for example, the Buddha spoke about attaining the 3 vijjas, the night of his awakening. So the vijja of remembering past lives, so direct knowledge of his own personal karmas and rebirths, and then knowledge of the karma and rebirth of all beings. So recognizing the universal nature of the functioning of karma and rebirth. And then the third vijja is the vijja of knowing how defilements arise in the mind and knowing how to eliminate defilement from the mind. So these are called the 3 vijja. And in this context, vijja is then normally translated as true knowledge. So it's this spiritual knowledge which recognizes the ultimate truth of things. So then when we say avijja, again, it's ignorance, not in the sense of like, I can't find Belarus on a map. So that's a kind of ignorance, but it's an ignorance which is completely irrelevant. It's like, well, it actually doesn't matter whether or not you can find Belarus on a map. Like, you can be completely ignorant of worldly things, and it doesn't make one difference at all. It's completely irrelevant. But rather, we're talking about lacking these 3 higher knowledges, lacking these 3 spiritual knowledges, the spiritual knowledge of the truth of the mind, the truth of reality. Spiritual knowledges of the functioning of karma and rebirth, and the how the mind can be free of defilement. This is the kind of true knowledge that we're actually interested in. So then avijja means not having those vijjas. Avijja means not having this direct understanding of karma and rebirth and this direct understanding of the overcoming of defilement. And so avijja yoga, again, this is interesting in that the Buddha is saying that we're actually attached to our own avijja. And it's like, well, why are we attached to avijja? If it's something which is obstructing us and harmful to us, why are we attached to avijja? And again, it's usually connected to self-identity. So we think this is who I am. This particular experience is who I am. So we also tend to identify with our own defilements and delusions. We think, oh, I am the person who loves chocolate and hates heavy breathers. I am the person who has this opinion or that belief. Like we identify very strongly with arbitrary details of our experience. And so that also means, again, identifying with the particular defilements that we have, identifying with the particular delusions that we have. And then we're not willing to let go of it because we think, well, this is who I really am. This is my true nature. So then in the sutta, then the Buddha goes into a bit more detail on these. And he's applying a very common framework that we see throughout the sutta. So next he says, Katamotra bhikkhave kama yoga. So what is the attachment to sensuality? He says, Ida bhikkhave ekacho. So here's someone. Kamanang samudayancha atangamancha asadancha adinavancha nisaranancha yatabhutang napajanati. So it says, here's someone does not accurately understand the arising and the disappearance, the gratification, the drawback, and the escape of sensuality, of sensory experiences. So the arising and disappearance, so this is perceiving impermanence. So recognizing that whatever sensory experience is currently happening is temporary. It's impermanent. It's subject to appearing and disappearing. It's not stable. It's not reliable. So when we recognize that something is impermanent, unstable, insubstantial, then we don't attach to it because we recognize that there's nothing that can be attached to it. So the Buddha is saying when there's no recognition of the impermanence of things, then we tend to get attached to them. And next, the gratification, drawback, and escape. Again, when we don't recognize these three characteristics of things, then we tend to get wrapped up in them. We tend to get obsessed with them. So recognizing gratification means acknowledging the pleasantness of experiences. So we're not actually pretending that everything is awful, but actually we acknowledge that there are pleasant and enjoyable aspects to our experiences. Otherwise, we wouldn't get obsessed with them. So we acknowledge the pleasantness that's there, but we also acknowledge the drawbacks, the disadvantages. So recognizing that any particular pleasant experience is always going to be a little bit unsatisfying. And even if it's a really, really nice experience, it's still temporary. And if we get attached to something temporary, then inevitably we suffer. We suffer when it changes or disappears. And recognizing that the experience of desire and attachment is inherently painful regardless. Even if an experience is really enjoyable and really long-lasting, then the desire and attachment in relation to that experience, that desire and attachment is inherently painful. It's inherently distressing. In fact, it reduces our ability to enjoy whatever is going on. And then knowing the escape, the nisarana, the escape. And the Buddha says elsewhere in the suttas that the escape is disenchantment and dispassion. So this cool, calm, serene state of mind, which is not obsessed with anything in particular, which doesn't rely upon anything in particular. So the Buddha is saying when somebody doesn't understand in terms of sensory experiences, sensual pleasure, when one does not understand its arising and disappearing, so its impermanence, and one does not understand its gratification, drawback, and escape, then this is what he means by attachment to sensuality. This is the basis of that. So he says, Tasa kamanang samudayancha atangamancha asadancha adinavancha nisaranancha yatabutang apajanato. So he says, because somebody doesn't understand these five things in terms of sensuality, he says, yokamesu, so then that person in relating to sensuality has kama raga, so a passion for sensuality, kama nandi, delight in sensuality, kama sneho, their affection for sensuality, kama mucha, infatuation with sensuality, kama pipasa, a thirst for sensuality, kama parilaha. The word parilaha literally means completely burning. So it has the sense of feverish passion. So like like when you say like, oh, I'm on fire, or like burning with passion for something. So this fever for sensuality, this feverish passion for sensuality. Kama josanam. A josana means adherence, sticking to something. And kama tanha, the craving for something, craving for sensuality. And he says sanuseti. So all of these things then are anusayas. So anuseti is the verb form of the Pali noun anusaya. Anusaya means a subconscious tendency, an underlying habit of mind. So he's saying all of these things then are present as the subconscious tendencies of mind, the basic underlying habits and momentum of mind, which we usually don't even recognize. It feels like the ground of the mind, the foundation of the mind. So the experienced foundation of the mind then is this passion, this delight, this affection, this attachment, this thirst, this fever, this adherence, this craving for sensuality. And the Buddha says, "Iyang vuchati bhikkhave kama yoga, iti kama yoga." And it says, so this is what's called kama yoga, attachment to sensuality. And thus there is attachment to sensuality. Yeah, so this is the kind of yoga that you shouldn't be doing, just to be clear on this. And then the Buddha gives the same description for the others. So he says, Bhava yogo chakatang hoti. And he says, and how is their bhava yoga, so attachment to being or attachment to personal experience. He gives the same analysis. He says, here someone does not accurately understand the arising and disappearance of bhava, of states of being, the gratification, drawback, and escape of states of being. So again, the same thing of when we don't see the impermanence of states of being, of personal experiences, when we don't recognize the gratification, the drawback, and the escape, then the mind gets fixated on these things. We're full of passion for states of being, of personal experience. We delight in them, we obsess about them, we crave them, we get stuck in them. And therefore we're not free from this kind of yoga, this kind of attachment, or again, bondage. So thinking of a work animal being yoked to a cart, they really can't do anything about it. They're stuck in that painful struggle. And he gives the same thing for ditti, for views, for perspectives and opinions. Similarly, when we don't recognize the arising, the disappearance, the gratification, the drawback, and the escape of viewpoints and opinions, of perspectives, then once again we fall into these same patterns of passion and delight and craving and fever and attachment and obsession with our views and opinions, with our ways of thinking about the world and seeing the world. Again, this becomes really clear anytime we start talking about politics. Everyone tends to have such incredibly strong views about politics and are absolutely convinced that their views are right and everybody else's views are wrong. But clearly, we can't all be right because we all have different views on the matter. So noticing how we tend to get really caught into views. Actually, elsewhere in the suttas, there's a sutta where the Buddha says that he's talking about the differences between lay people and monastics. And he says, lay people fight over sensuality, monastics fight over viewpoints, fight over opinions. Of course, lay people also fight over opinions. Monastics, we don't fight over sensuality that much because we just don't have very much to fight over. I guess it comes up over chocolate or something. But actually, usually we're pretty good about sharing the chocolate, I think. Yeah. But you start talking about things like, oh, is Patita Samuppada, is it 3 lifetimes or 1 lifetime or 1 moment? And then you'll get some pretty heated arguments. What does the Buddha mean by the word chitta? Oh boy. Yeah, then we get into some pretty heated discussions. And then the Buddha applies the same thing. He says, avijja yoga chakatang hoti. So, and what is avijja yoga? The attachment to ignorance, this attachment to the lack of true knowledge. Which also, again, it's interesting. So in theory, Buddhist practice is about attaining vijja. It's attaining the true knowledge, the direct understanding of the nature of reality. And yet we're so attached to avijja. We're attached to our ignorant, incomplete perspective on the world. And I think a lot of this, once again, has to do with the fact that it feels like me. It feels comfortable. It feels familiar. It's like, oh, this is who I am. This is my comfortable, familiar experience. And even though it's painful and unsatisfying, still it feels like me. And if there's one thing we love more than anything else, it's things that feel like me, things that feel personal. No, even though it's inherently painful, there's something familiar about it, and it's comforting in that familiarity. But here the Buddha gives a slightly different answer than with the previous ones. So with Kama Yoga, he described it as not knowing the origin, disappearance, gratification, drawback, and escape of Kama, of sensuality. With Bhava, again, it's the same 5 things of Bhava. With Ditti, same 5 things of Ditti. But with Avijja, he says, how is there Avijja? He says, Ida ekacho chanang pasayatananang. Samodayancha atangamancha asadansha adinavancha nisaranancha yathabutang napajanati. So he's saying here someone does not understand the origin, disappearance, gratification, drawback, and escape of the 6 senses, of the 6 sense domains. So chanang pasayatanang, the 6 sense domains. So the basis of ignorance, of lacking true knowledge, is because we don't have a clear understanding of our 6 senses. So sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. These 6 basic sense domains through which we understand our experience. The Buddha is saying because we don't understand the appearance and disappearance of these 6 sense domains, because we don't understand the gratification, drawback, and escape in terms of these 6 sense domains, this is why we fall again and again into avijja. This is why we're not able to reach true understanding. It's because we don't really understand our own sensory experiences. We don't understand the impermanent and impersonal nature of our own sensory experiences. And then he says, Tasa chanang pasayatananang samudayancha atangamancha asa dansha adinavancha nisaranansha yathabutang apajanato. Says because we do not understand these 5 things in terms of the 6 senses. He says, Ya chasu pasayatanesu avijja anyanang sanuseti. So he says, then regarding these 6 senses, there's this underlying tendency of ignorance and a lack of knowledge. So not knowing, not understanding. And he says, Ayang vorchati bhikkhave avijja yogo. So this is the attachment to ignorance. So it comes from not seeing, in particular, the anicca and the dukkha characteristics of the 6 senses. So samudayancha and atangamancha, so the arising and disappearance is talking about anicca sanya. And asadansha, adinavancha, nisaranansha, so the gratification, drawback, and escape is recognizing the dukkha characteristic, so dukkha sanya. And so then the Buddha goes on, he says, Iti kama yogo, bhava yogo, ditti yoga, vijja yogo. So thus there is attachment to sensuality, attachment to being, attachment to views, and attachment to ignorance. So these the 4 kinds of yoga that he mentioned. And he says, Sangyuto papakehi kusalehi dhammehi sankalesikehi pono bhavikehi sadarehi dukkha vipakehi ayating jati jara maranakehi tasma yoga kemi ti vochati. So he says, thus one is bound by harmful, unwholesome phenomena, which are defiling, which lead to rebirth, which are dangerous, which result in suffering, and lead to future birth, aging, and death. So again, because of these 4 kinds of attachment, this is what keeps us swirling around in the cyclic cesspool of samsara, constant rebirth within the cesspool. And he says, Tasma ayoga kemi tivochati. He says, so therefore one is called ayoga kemi, so not free from yoga, not safe from yoga. So one who is not free from attachment. It says, Emeko bhikkhave chattaro yoga. So these are the 4 kinds of yoga, 4 kinds of attachment. And then next he says, chattaro me bhikkhave visang yoga. So yoga, again, means attachment, and visang yoga means to be detached, unattached. So not fixated, not stuck on something. He says, katame chattaro, what for? Kama yoga visang yoga. So to be free from, so not stuck on attachment to sensuality. And similarly, bhava yoga visang yoga, ditti yoga visang yoga, avijja yoga visang yoga. So not to be attached to states of being, to views, or to ignorance. And then for each of these, he gives the opposite statement from before. So how is there detachment from sensuality, so not being attached to sensuality? He says it's through accurately understanding the arising, the disappearance, the gratification, drawback, and escape in terms of sensuality. And when we understand in this way, then we don't have these underlying tendencies of passion for sensuality, delight for sensuality, affection for sensuality, fever for sensuality, etc. And he again gives the same analysis for being and for views. So when we understand these 5 aspects of being and 5 aspects of views, then we don't fall into these subconscious habits of passion, obsession, fixation, affection, adherence to being and to views. And then finally with avijja. So again, with avijja, the Buddha is focusing particularly on the understanding of the 6 senses. So saying when we accurately understand the arising and the disappearance of the 6 senses, the gratification, drawback, and escape of the 6 senses, then there is not this underlying tendency towards ignorance and misunderstanding of the 6 senses. So here the Buddha is, again, he's pointing more towards the concept of non-self. So when we understand the 6 senses clearly, then we recognize that this is just a function of nature. It's not ultimately who we are or what we are. It's just a function of nature. And this is what gives the capacity for the arising of true knowledge, of true understanding. It's recognizing the impersonal nature of the 6 senses. And the Buddha says then when one is not caught in these 4 kinds of attachment, then one is free from harmful, unwholesome phenomena, which are defiling, which produce rebirth, which are dangerous, which result in suffering and in future birth, aging, and death. And therefore, one is free from yoga, safe from yoga. One is no longer caught in attachment. And he ends with saying, Emeko bhikkhave chattaro visang yogati. He says, so these are the 4 kinds of non-attachment. And then he ends with a short poem. And the poem is basically just repeating what he already said in the sutta, so I won't bother with going through the poem. So at this time we can end with 3 sadhus to respect the sutta, and then I'll take whatever questions you have. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So first off, hello to all the people checking in online. So hello to Manal, John, Maria, Kumu, Edward, Priyani, Luisa, Sud, Jeff, Geeta, Drums, JS, Kit, Akshata, Tate, Miguel, and Naranjan. Welcome. And Jeff asks, are you mentioning the 3 vijjas in the context of avijja to make the point that avijja is limited to wrong views about those 3 vijjas? No, because that's not what vijja is limited to. I was making that point there to emphasize that when we talk about avijja, we're not talking about ignorance of ordinary worldly knowledge. So for example, if you ask me what the capital of Nigeria is, I have no idea. So does that mean I'm ignorant about geography? Actually, yeah, it does. But that actually doesn't matter because it has nothing to do with awakening. If I was a geography teacher, that would be a problem, but I'm not. If our priority is knowing the capitals of different countries, then that's a pretty problematic kind of ignorance. But if our priority is attaining awakening, then when we talk about ignorance, we're not talking about a lack of worldly knowledge. We're talking about a lack of understanding of how to train and purify the mind. So we're talking about a lack of understanding of objective reality, the way things really are. Avijja, again, and if we want to be precise, we would say that avijja is a lack of direct understanding of the three characteristics, a lack of a direct understanding of anicca, dukkha, anatta. This is what we would mean by avijja, or a lack of a complete experiential understanding of the Four Noble Truths. That's another way of talking about avijja. It's not just the three vijjas that the awakened being attained on the night of awakening. That's just one example of a way of talking about true spiritual knowledge, which we call vijja. And Jeff says, what does bhava, states of being, refer to? Healthy, sick, wealth, poverty, happy, calm, sad, etc., or some other type of state or being? And those are examples. It's more in the category of some kind of personal experience, or personal state of being, or an identity. So some kind of individual status or state of being. So actually things like I want to be a human, or I want to be a cat, or I want to be an angel, or those are all examples of bhava, states of being. I mentioned earlier, like I want to be a teacher, or I want to be a writer, or I want to be whatever, a traveler, or things like I want to be respected, I want to be liked, I want to be appreciated. These are all examples of bhava tanha, of bhava yoga. So desire and attachment for particular states of being, states of personal experience. And Sud says, I thought Buddha recommended mindfulness of body to lessen sensual desire. Can perception of impermanence meditation also allow us to destroy sensual cravings? Yes, absolutely. So when you recognize that whatever you're craving is impermanent, then that tends to reduce one's craving for it substantially. And actually, if you do this practice properly, it will completely eliminate that sensual craving. And I see a few more people checking in. So hello to Cam, Jayanta, Pial, and Tora. Pial says, are these four yoga corresponding to the four asavas? Yes. Actually, that's well caught. In fact, the list is exactly the same as the list of the four asavas. And it says, Pial continues, clinging to these yogas perhaps cause asavas, defilements, which could be implicit memories that keep coming up and distort our perception in the present. So clinging to these four yogas perhaps causes asavas. Yes, yeah, that's true. These four kinds of attachment will strengthen one's underlying defilements. Yeah, that's one of the main points the Buddha is making here. Yep. It says, I don't understand what you mean by implicit memories, though. So maybe if you have some more explanation of what you mean, then I can give some response. Any other questions from the monastery residents? Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned the Bhava yoga.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the beginning one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I forgot which one I was thinking about, but it was the one after that.
Ditti?
Oh yeah. Ditti.
Views, opinions, perspectives.
So I was curious to kind of like understand how, like in Buddhist perspective, like at least for me, for myself, like sometimes I can get stuck on these like views of like Buddhism views, like not just like like what's Buddhist, but actually like how like seeing things as they are. So like I recall myself sometimes like when I realize like someone I'm associating with outside the monastery will emphasize on like something scientific scientific, then I'll be like everything is just um like I'll just look at that person like what's wrong with you? Like it's just made up stuff. Like this like the Buddhist practice is like this is just the nature of our life. So like I realize that sometimes I'll be stuck in that view where like it's kind of like taking it personal too.
Mm.
Um so I realize that like that affects my mind. So so my question is basically how like in like while practicing Buddhism, how do we um, detach from the view? So like I'm experiencing the yoga, I guess.
Yeah, well, the thing also is that so what we're trying to cultivate right view. So the Buddha doesn't talk about getting rid of all views, all ditthis. He talks about letting go of miccha ditthi and cultivating samma ditthi. So actually, we should be attached to samma ditthi.
There's a difference between objective things and
So samma ditthi is, for example, the correct understanding of the Four Noble Truths. Correct understanding of karma and rebirth, correct understanding of anicca, dukkha, anatta. That's all samma ditthi. So actually, we want to be attached to that kind of right view because that's what will help us progress towards awakening. And what we should be letting go of is miccha ditthi, wrong view. And then things which are neutral. So again, opinions like this soccer team is better than that soccer team. Well, that's neutral ditthi. It's not right view or wrong view. It's just stupid view. So it doesn't really matter which view you have because it's kind of pointless either way. So that's something where you just recognize, okay, so I have my view. I have my view that the Rutgers team is better than that other school's team. Well, okay, it's just a view. Just see it as a view. Which is conditioned by your particular experiences and ultimately insignificant and irrelevant and meaningless. So don't have any attachment to that view and just recognize it as something silly which arose because of particular conditions. So, but definitely we shouldn't be letting go of right view because right view is what keeps us pointed towards awakening. Again, in the common simile of the raft, the really important point of the simile of the raft is that you need the raft to get from one side to the other side. So our raft is right view. So if you let go of the raft before you reach the other shore, then you're going to get in serious trouble. You're going to get swept away, or you're going to drown, or you're going to get lost. So you want to hold tightly to that raft until you reach awakening. And that is samma ditthi. So yeah, when you encounter people who have worldly priorities, then of course we're going to have a little bit of difference. It's like, oh, so you prioritize seeing things in a materialist way. Well, that's too bad for you, but whatever. You can live your miserable, pointless life. That's fine, as you wish. But you don't need to try to convince them to be otherwise. You just recognize that they're relating to the world with very different priorities than you are. And that their priorities, unfortunately, are the kind that result in more suffering for them. And that's sad, but there's not really much you can do about it. And instead, you remain committed to your own spiritual priorities and spiritual values, recognizing that this is a path which brings genuine happiness.
Yeah, thank you. That really helps. Also, I wanted to add on that. So, like, I guess like I'll apply. Like, I'll remember some of the things I just said, and like I'll try to apply that. But how do I also like see it in a positive, way where I'm not just completely seeing it like, oh, like you suck, or like you're not happy at all, but like kind of like seeing it more of like, okay, like whatever works for them, like if that makes you happy, like seeing it in a joyful way. Because sometimes I feel like that will also affect my mind, where like it's fine if they're okay with it. Like I just know like what's okay with like what
Yeah.
I'm listening.
Yeah, I mean, exactly that. It's like, well, okay, if this is how you want to relate to the world, then okay, that's fine. You can do whatever you want. So again, the world is actually predominantly full of people who don't really care about spiritual practice. That's okay. That's what they do with their lives. That's their choice. They can do whatever they want. May they be happy. So we don't need to get into judging others, because it's really beside the point. Each person is making their own choices and experiencing their own consequences. So the real question is, are we making wholesome choices which lead towards awakening? So other people will do whatever they do, and they have their own priorities. And so we let other people be however they want to be. And we focus on keeping to our own priorities and not getting too caught up in what other people do. And instead, what's actually really helpful when we have substantially different priorities than other people is we try to look for praiseworthy qualities in them. Like, do they have some kindness that we can appreciate? Do they have some generosity that we can appreciate? Do they have some thoughtfulness or some serenity or some equanimity? Is there something in them, some kind of goodness in them that we can observe and appreciate? And so we fixate on appreciating the good qualities that they have. And then when people start going on and on about things that are irrelevant to us, then we just wait patiently until they stop talking. That's what I do anyway.
Yeah, that's one of the things I recognize. Whenever I've seen someone just talk about something extremely worldly, and I see your perspective is just sit there patiently.
Yeah, when you don't engage with people around a topic, eventually they give up.
I don't know.
And sometimes they don't, in which case you make an excuse to leave the room. You had a question?
I did, yeah. Thank you, Bhante. I was wondering about karma yoga and relating that to meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And wondering about, lately, especially the past few months, my meditation has gotten more and more pleasurable. And I find myself attaching to that a bit. Even if it's not pleasurable, I still just keep going with it. But I'm just wondering if that's okay right now with where I'm at in my practice, or if I should be wary of that, of attaching to the pleasure, or of wanting to go deeper with that.
Well, we should probably talk in more detail another time about your specific meditation experiences. But just broadly speaking, so having pleasurable meditation is usually a good thing, because it tends to support concentration and also keeps us motivated. But it's also good to recognize that is a conditional and unreliable experience. So you can remember that there's been many, many times when your meditation was not particularly pleasurable. So actually, I knew one person who got into this thing of having really blissful euphoric meditation, and he was saying how then he kind of got this view that if the meditation is euphoric, then that's a good meditation. If it's not euphoric, that's a bad meditation. So he went through this long period of time where basically every time he sat down to meditate, he'd have this incredible ecstatic experience. And then at some point it just stopped. He would sit down to meditate and that ecstasy just wasn't happening. And then he just stopped meditating entirely. He just lost his motivation to meditate. It dropped away entirely for a few months. And wound up having a really miserable life, and eventually decided to become a monk again. So there's a happy ending to the story, which was the part, yeah. But there was this kind of dark period where because he had formed this idea that meditation equals pleasure, that actually created the conditions for him to lose interest in meditating when the conditions changed. So we just keep practicing, whether it's pleasurable or not. We just keep developing mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. And sometimes that's going to be euphoric and blissful, and sometimes it's going to be boring, and sometimes it's going to be bland, and whatever it is, we just keep going. And don't expect it to be any particular way, and don't rely on it being any particular way. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm doing that. I think it's okay because it is kind of just like this.
Mm.
So yeah, I have more questions, but I'll ask later.
Okay. Anything else? Okay.
I just wanted to also understand, like, how do I know the difference between karma and karma? Like,
The two words?
yeah.
So you actually just said it right there. So kama and kamma. So kama is sensuality. Kamma is action. Karma.
Is it spelled the same?
No.
How is it spelled?
So K, A with a line over, M-A. So kama, sensuality. And then K-A-M-M-A, kamma, action.
I have one more question. Would you be able to clarify avijja for me? I know you mentioned it earlier, and like throughout, but like I'm having, I'm not understanding it clearly.
Fundamentally, it's not directly perceiving anicca dukkha anatta, not directly perceiving the impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal nature of all things. That's avijja. It's one way of talking about it. Another is that not directly perceiving the Four Noble Truths. Because if we did directly perceive the Four Noble Truths, then we would immediately drop the causes of our dukkha. The moment we recognized that we're hurting ourselves, then we would stop. Another way is just that we don't recognize that everything is empty of self. That's just another way of talking about what we've already been talking about as well.
So is it like the lack of knowing? Is that like?
Yeah, but it needs to be clarified. It's a lack of a direct perception, not lack of knowing in the sense of an intellectual idea. So we have the intellectual idea of the Buddha's teachings. What we lack is the direct perception. So the direct perception has to be developed. It has to be trained. Because again, you can tell yourself whatever you want. So again, like you read a book about weightlifting, that doesn't make you strong. You have to actually go to the gym and work at it for months, and then your body gets a bit stronger. But just reading the book about it doesn't make you any stronger. It just gives you some information about how to become strong. But the book doesn't actually make you strong. It's the same. So right now we have an intellectual knowledge of the Buddha's teachings, but we don't yet have vijja. So vijja is something that we train, we develop over time through practice, through persistence.
Alright, thank you.
Briefly, Bhante, which one of those would be Chinta and Bhavana of Sutta, Chinta and Bhavana, my opinion?
So we're actually running out of time. So I think before we start getting into new things, we should probably, there's a couple more questions online that I should take, and then we should wrap up. So Jeff says, could Bhava Yoga be said to be attachment to any desired for or current state of being within the cycle of rebirth? Yeah. Any current state of being or any wished for state of being. Yeah. Yep. He also says, explicit memories are working memory and episodic memories that are easily recognizable. Implicit memories are memories that are deep-seated and keep coming up from time to time. Yeah, I have to say, Pial, I'm sorry. I still don't understand your question. So there might be like some terminology here that I'm just not used to. I don't get it. I'm sorry. So I think we should go ahead and end it this time so we can conclude the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu. Sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.